Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how I turn a calabash bowl. And you're probably wondering, what is a calabash bowl? It's going to be a round bottom bowl. You see here, we don't have a foot or any flat spots on here. That allows that bowl to sit and rock, find its natural balance point. And this is going to be turned out of green wood, and it allows this bowl, as it dries, because we turn this thin, it moves, it warps, and it changes shape, and then you end up with a really, really cool looking bowl. So if you see here, this bowl has gone very oval. And where we had some figure, it's kind of gone curly and wavy right here on the side grain. And on a piece of material like this, all the open pores, you can feel the really cool texture from the wood itself once it dried. And it's pretty cool seeing the process of this material drying throughout the day. Once I turned it, I left it on my desk, and over the course of a day, this thing was just changing shape as it was drying. And because we turn this nice and even, consistent wall thickness, we don't have any cracking or any issues that way, but it's a really fun project. And it's a good way to get to the lathe if all you have is green wetwood material to work with. So the material that we're going to be turning this out of is going to be Gambel's oak. This is a white oak, but it's got some really, really cool color patterns through it. It almost looks like an olive wood with an oak pattern to it. So this is going to make another gorgeous bowl, and I'm excited to turn this one. And I'll show you my tips and tricks along the way as we go through this. We'll cover some of the basic stuff that you guys probably already know. But if you're the first time viewer and you're just getting into bowl turning, you'll get some good tips and tricks there. But let's get our piece mounted on the lathe and let's start turning. All right, so it's time to get this piece mounted on the lathe. We'll be using a screw chuck, and I've got this pre-drilled for the screw chuck. But if we take a look at the wood grain here, this is going to be the open bowl face. And if you see if you see the growth rings here, you can see this is essentially, a half log. And so as this dries, this is going to close over on itself, and that's what we're looking for. If I flip this around and turn the bowl on the back side here, it's not going to move as much as I want it to. So we'll have the growth ring side towards the pith. That's going to be our open bowl face. But let's go ahead and get this mounted on the lathe. And with this screw chuck here, the external thread dimensions are 3/8, so you drill a 1/4 inch because that's what the root of the threads is, just for reference. And we'll have this spinning nice and slow. And you can put this on while the lathe is spinning. Obviously, do it safely. Make sure you're not using a square blank to do this. And then as soon as that seats up against the face of that collar there, it just takes the bowl out of your hands. And you don't want to do this at full turning speed, obviously nice and slow. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it that way, go ahead and just thread that on by hand. There's no harm in doing it that way as well. So first thing we want to do is get this blank squared up, get this running true, and we'll square up this face as well. And once we get that done, then we can bump up our turning RPM speed and start roughing this to our nice shape that we want. We'll just use that revolving center for a little extra support during the roughing process. And as far as our tool rest height, we'll be using a 5/8 bar diameter gouge to rough this down. We want our cutting edge to be right about at center. That's going to be just a touch high still. There we go. So that's going to be good. And what we're going to do is, as we start roughing this around, we're just looking to get this running nice and true. So we're going to bring this here, and we're going to start on this side and work this across those end grain fibers. And then we're going to come back from this side and then just clean up this end as well. If we work this all the way across the face and off this side, it blows these fibers out. And I want to maintain as much of the thickness of this blank as possible. Because generally for calabash bowls, the deeper they are, the better. This is 3 inches thick by roughly 8.5 diameter. I wish it was just a little bit bigger and a little bit deeper, maybe a 4 to 5 inch depth. So I want to maximize as much of the material here as possible. Let's go ahead and throw our safety glasses on. And because we're turning wet wood, it's nice, it keeps the dust down. That's why it's one of those good beginner projects. Turning wet wood is easier to cut. It's a lot more forgiving on you as well. And just the dust is really nice. You don't have a lot of dust in your shop. So let's bring this up to speed. So right now we're just under 800 RPM. For this size of bowl, that's a good turning speed. Once we get this trued up, we'll bump that up to about 11 to 1200. I generally turn a little bit faster on the high end of safe, but if you're not comfortable turning at that RPM, you can always just slow your lathe down a little bit. One other thing too, I don't know if you can tell, I'm standing out of the line of fire. I don't want to stand directly in line with the bowl. If you're turning a piece that might have cracks in it, or you're not sure of how sound the material is, you never want to stand directly in the line of fire. if I had a really bad catch or something catastrophic happened where this bowl came off the lathe, it's going to be coming in a straight line. So stand off to the side. If you're a right-handed turner, you can always just try and keep your head out of the way a little bit. Worst case, it'll hit your arm or your shoulder. But me being a lefty, I like to stand over here. And if you're a righty, you could stand on this side of the lathe and do that same cut. And we're not taking a heavy pass here. We're taking about an eighth of an inch shaving. I'll stop there, and then I'm going to come from this side so I don't blow out the fibers. There we go, we're running nice and true. So we got just a little bit of wax there, but that's going to be fine. We might just throw a bead up here on the top just for some added decoration, but you can see how pretty of a grain structure we have running through this piece. And the reason I came back from this side to make that cut is all these fibers here on this face are unsupported. So as that gouge comes across, they blow those fibers out, and then we reduce, roughly 1/16 of our overall height, and I don't want to do that. So now that we got that face running true, we got the blank, it's nice and concentric now. We'll need to move our tailstock back just a little bit, take advantage of the longer quill on this lathe, and get our tool rest in here on the end. And we're going to square up this face. And this is going to be just a nice dragging cut. We're just going to drag this and scrape that surface across. Depending on how out or round or how wobbly the bottom side of your blank here, you're going to have to go fairly light because it's going to be skipping on cutting and then missing and then cutting and missing. And if you try to take too heavy of a cut, it just kind of kicks your gouge around. So we're just going to go down to the center, and then we're going to work our way back. And I've got that flute about a 9 o'clock position, 9:30. And we just work this back and forth till we get that blank nice and squared up. Okay, now that that's running nice and true, I'm going to set my tool rest at about a 30-degree angle, just a little oblique here to the corner so we can get this corner off and start getting the shape that we want. Now that we're running true, we can also bump up our speed. So right now I'm at about 1100 RPM, and this is going to be basically a drawing cut, a pull cut. This is a good way to just remove a lot of material really fast. Now we got a pretty good gap. You can see we're removing material very quickly. We're moving at a fast RPM, which allows us to move our tool through that wood a lot quicker. The slower the RPM, the slower the feed rate of the tool. So keep that in mind. You can see we're starting to get that bowl shape. And as you're roughing this down, this is about the time you want to start thinking about your form and what kind of added decorative details you want. So if I grab the bowl that I turned the first one, very simple, just a nice rounded shape. But if you wanted to, you could add some beads right here, which we might do. You could add just a single bead at the top and look at the form and the shape you have depending on the material and size you're working with, and start thinking of how you can be creative with your shape. See if there's a little added decorative touches you can put on the piece as you're roughing this down. A lot of times when I'm bowl turning, I kind of get in the automation mode where I just start roughing it to the shape I normally do, and then by the time I think of, hey, maybe I should add something here or there, I've already removed that material and it's gone. So during your roughing process, think about where you can add some nice little decorative touches. Now I'm going to work here towards the rim, And the calabashes always have a closed over rim, meaning it draws in a little bit at the top. So I'm gonna work from the headstock end, cutting this side, and then that way it's a nice supported fiber and a bevel riding cut as well. All right, I'm really liking that shape. Gonna move that tool rest back around. And I'm gonna do a little beaded section right here. I think that's gonna be a nice decorative touch. And the curvature, if I'm looking at the horizon here, that curve continues through where the beaded section is and then closes over on the rim, and I like that there. So I'm just gonna taper this down just a little bit so it matches our curve. There we go. Now it's time to lay out the foot that we're gonna grip with our jaws. I'm using these are the shark jaws. I need to size the tenon appropriately for these. So I've got my dividers already set. And the trick with these, if you're gonna be using your dividers to mark your foot, make sure you only use the front leg. You never wanna engage this back leg here, or else it'll catch it and it'll flip this over and it might hit you in the face. So make sure you keep this, the rear leg away from the workpiece, but close enough you can see if the lines match up. So those points are right in line with each other. That's gonna be the size of tenon that I need. And that looks like a really small tenon for this size of bowl, but I like having a smaller tenon just so I can get the shape as close as I want to before I start hollowing out the inside. If I had a 5 or 4 inch diameter foot down here, I'm not gonna be able to get the curve, and it's a lot harder to eyeball on the inside as far as getting your measurements and the wall thickness, especially since we're going fairly thin on this piece. I'm gonna switch to my skew now to cut that dovetail tenon. And we're gonna go about a 1/4 inch deep. One tool that I find incredibly useful for cutting dovetails is the dovetailer. This is Henry Taylor's tool, and I've ground it so it's the exact angle for my chuck jaws. And the nice thing is it gives you a really, really good flat. It's a little grabby on this oak, so I'm just gonna raise that handle to put that in a trailing position. But the great thing is it gives you the really flat registration surface where a lot of the grip strength comes from for your chuck jaws, and in the right appropriate angle for the tenon as far as the taper to it. So now that we have our tenon for the chuck jaws we're using, let's finish shaping the exterior and refining that a little bit. And then once we get our shape where we want it, we'll do a push cut to get a nice clean surface off the tool. That scraping cut with this gouge here is really good for removing a lot of material fast, but it doesn't give us a very clean surface. And I want a nice clean surface, and generally on the calabashes, turning these wet, we don't normally sand them, but I'm gonna be sanding this piece. So let's get that tool rest back around where we're gonna be working. Okay, if you don't want to do a push cut, you can always drop that handle way down low like it's in your pocket and close that flute over, and we can use that same gouge. So instead of scraping, now we're shear scraping, and this should give us a lot better surface. Yeah, it's definitely refined the surface. This edge is probably just a little bit dull now after removing that much oak. So let's go to a different gouge and we'll do a push cut. All right, so we've removed the tailstock, and I'm gonna bump up my speed just a hair, right? We're at about 1200 RPM. The faster this is spinning, the cleaner of a cut that we get, and I wanna maximize the surface finish off the tool. And one thing you need to make sure of is because we're removing the tailstock and we're just on the screw, we're gonna be doing light cuts. We don't wanna be taking crazy amounts of material here. And this is the 40/40 gouge, so this is gonna be a great gouge and a good grind for our push cut. And we'll start that on the bevel. Very light pressure on the wood. And I'm looking to make sure that the cut thickness stays the same all the way throughout the cut. That means I'm maintaining the shape that I already had. If the cut is increasing or decreasing as you're going throughout the curve, that means you're changing the shape. I don't think that was too bad for doing that on camera on a demo. That was actually really smooth, but that surface finish is extremely smooth. I'm gonna just hit that with some 320 grit paper and call it a day. Yeah, that surface is really good. Now we'll do the same from the top side of the bowl here towards that beaded section. Blocking the movement of the tool. All I want is downward pressure into the tool rest, not into the workpiece. And you can see those curls, we're getting very nice curls, very good surface. All right, now let's do our little beaded section. This is just a little bit thicker of material here than I want. I'm just gonna remove some of this. I'd say about by half as thick as I have here. There we go. And then we can just lay out some beads here with our pencil and just see what we like. You could do a bunch of smaller 1/8 inch beads. Let's do 3 medium beads. Just gonna create some small V grooves with my skew here just to lay this out. There we go. Use my spindle gouge here. Again, we are cutting into end grain fibers. Now what we're going to do, let's move to the bowl gouge here. Now that we got those roughed out, let's go to our skew just to refine these a little bit. All right, now let's just tidy up where the curve meets the bead. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. That's going to be about it for the outside. So I'm just going to hit this with some 320 grit paper. And if you need to, use that paper to refine those beads. I'm not very good at putting beads on a bowl. I don't normally do it. So I don't have as much practice as I'd like. But I think those turned out okay. I know there's a bunch of different ways of doing beads. You can roll them with your gouge. I just haven't practiced that enough to do it that way on camera. All right. Stop the lathe and take a look here. Make sure we don't have any tear out on our beads. Obviously this surface is all good. I'm not worried about tear out here. And then we'll finish this flat area and the foot once we rechuck it. But the exterior of this piece looks really good. Okay, so we got a nice shape there. That looks really good. I'm really happy with this, especially once we finish that foot and round that over and continue that curve on the bottom. That's gonna be a nice looking little calabash. And for my chuck jaws here, so I'm using a VM120, and these are the extended or the shark jaws. And the reason I'm using these jaws over the standard just 2.5 dovetail jaws is this gets my bowl further away from the chuck. So once we have this mounted in here, That'll give me more clearance if I need to true up the surface or shear scrape this. Instead of that being right up against the chuck body, this pushes it out and gives me clearance to get my tool in there and make cuts if I need to. So I generally don't use the 2.5 inch dovetails, hardly ever, because this is the same diameter of jaw, but it gives me basically 2 inches off the chuck body. And if we look at our surface here, so our grain direction is run in this direction. If I mount that in the jaws directly in line with one of the gaps, it's going to be compressing my tenon at an uneven rate. The side grain fibers squeeze in a lot more than the end grain fibers compress, and it causes your bowl to not run true. So what I want to do is basically put this at a 45 to one of those slots, and we should get a more accurate, true running bowl. If you've ever turned a bowl and remounted it in your tenon and it wasn't running perfectly true, or it was running really out of true, that's probably why. Those end grain fibers, they don't give and they don't compress very much, but those side grain fibers, they squish in a lot. So by just shifting your bowl 45 degrees roughly, you can see my grain direction is running this way, and the jaws, that slot right there is at the 12 o'clock position. So just by rotating that over, we should have a more accurate, true running bowl. And you can see that's ever so slightly out of round, or not running perfectly true, but that's a lot better than what happens if I rotate that right on 12 o'clock. So let's go ahead and tighten this down now. Tighten both the pinion gears. We're going to be doing some fairly heavy cuts on a very small tenon. Ideally, I like to run a little bit bigger tenon, but for a calabash, where I want to have that curve so I can match that a lot easier on the interior, we're going to run that smaller tenon there. All right, so we've got our tool rest set up. Let's face off the front side of this blank here. That piece is moving even more now. I think it's starting to warp and dry a little bit. If you wanted to, you could true it up, but I'm going to leave it because this piece is going to warp a lot anyway. So let's just lightly scrape the face of this to give us a square surface. And we can start roughing this down. Something we're talking about, if you watch a lot of people turn bowls, they immediately start in the center and sweeping this out and doing the bowl shape profile. However, if you're watching the way I'm doing it here, we're basically going straight in. We're cutting all directly into side grain fibers and peeling those out, and it's going to be a lot more efficient to remove material. We don't want to start getting our curve at this point in the process while we're roughing this down, because as soon as you start that sweep, you're hitting into end grain fibers, and it's a lot more difficult to cut and slower to do. So I'm just getting this here, making sure my cutting edge is on the bevel and it's supported. And then we're basically just kind of working towards the center in a straight line. I'm not worried about sweeping the handle, swinging it around and getting that bowl shape yet. We're just getting material removed from the center of our bowl. And because we're going fairly thin on this piece, we want to be under 1/4 inch thickness all the way throughout, so that way it doesn't crack. We want to keep all this mass in the center as we work our rim thickness down towards the base. By keeping this here in the center, that's going to keep this piece running true. If I remove all of the supporting fiber down to where the bottom of the bowl is going to be on the inside, and then I start trying to get my final wall thickness out here on the rim, this piece is just going to be moving because there's no support for it. So I want to go in here about the first 1 to 2 inches and get material out of the way so we can start getting our curve and our thickness that we need. All right, now that we have the material out of the way, we're about at a 1/4 inch at the very rim, but it isn't, we're gonna have a fairly substantial undercut here on this rim. So I'm gonna switch to a different gouge. I'm gonna go to the 40/40, and this is a little bit smaller of a gouge as well. And if we take a look at it, you can see I've ground the heel off. That should minimize the tool marks on the inside of the bowl and allow us to make the undercut and the curve that we need. And because this is about a 1/4 inch here at the rim, I'm gonna start just on the inside, and I'll point the bevel direction where I need to go to make that curve on the inside of the bowl. But we're gonna have to bring our tool handle quite a ways away from our body to make this. Swinging the handle towards myself. All right, so now that I've made that cut there, if you feel it by your fingers, you can see, like, you can tell if the curvature is looking good. But let's grab our double-ended calipers here and just check wall thickness. So I'm right about a 1/4, and that's fairly consistent all the way to the beaded section, and obviously that's going to be a little bit heavier. So this is nice and good here, but there are some tiny little tool mark ridges that I'll get out once we get some more material out of our way. And we kind of want to work this down in steps. The thinner and thinner you go, the more you need to work it down in kind of layers to get the wall thickness you need. If we hogged out all the center material, all the supporting timber, and then try to do this as a single pass from the rim down to the base, you know, at an 1/8 or a 3/16, there's going to be too much flex in the piece, and it's going to be moving on you. So doing this incrementally, stepping it down while the fibers are supported, is going to be a lot better for you. So flipping the gouge over at about the 9 o'clock position. We're doing a bevel riding cut here, and this is peeling the wood away. It's all side grain cuts, so we can remove a lot of that, but we're gonna still keep that center dome there for support. All right, so this little step right here, this is where we ended that cut to get our wall thickness. That's nice at a 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna pick up the cut there, eyeball your exterior curve, and make sure that your bevel is gonna be making the same curve outside and inside. Use the heel of the gouge just to remove a bunch of shavings if you need. And then we'll pick that up and do one more cleanup. That noise was the shank of the gouge hitting the rim here. This is a fairly severe undercut, and I might need to go to a steeper gouge to be able to make the curve the way we need to. Yeah, that feels good there. The beaded section obviously adds some mass to it, but we've got plenty of material down here to remove, so let's step this down a little bit further. We'll go back to that bigger gouge. If the shavings get too built up in there and you're going really, really thin, you can have your bowl break apart by trying to grab those and catch them out. All right, let's check that wall thickness now with our calipers. So the reason I'm using these calipers, these are the double-ended calipers. So whatever I'm clamping onto, it shows me the measurement down on this end, and you can use them either direction. So if you're trying to measure, you know, your base down in between the chuck jaws, you can use these longer tapered end, or if you're doing a bowl or anything like that, this big curve here allows us to get inside our bowl. And I'm not squishing it hard because I don't want to leave marks on the wood, but just enough to where both points are contacting. And you can see we're just over, we're probably 5/16 to 3/8 right there. And then if I swing it around down to the bottom, we're about 1/2 inch to 5/8. So the beaded section, that's thin, it kind of down in the low spot of the bead, the peak of the bead. I think that wall thickness here is fine. That's nice and thin. So let's step down this support material, and if you wanted to, we could do a negative rake scrape on that rim there just to clean that up. I'll show you what I do if I need to do that while trying to minimize any flex in the material. I'll grab a bunch of shavings, and I'll use this to support the outside of the bowl, and then we'll use a negative rake scraper. This is the extra heavy French curve. The shavings are giving us that support to keep the rim from flexing, and then I'm using my thumb on top of the tool to help give my hand a reference point as far as where the cut is being made. Getting nice and thin. Got a tiny bit of chatter there, but the negative rake scraper is going to excel on the end grain fibers here. So that curve is good. Thickness is really good, basically to here past that beaded section. Now let's get this center area removed, get that down, and then we can start getting the curve on the inside and our final wall thickness. Just gonna get these shavings out of here. That's a bunch of weight on that really thin wall thickness I don't want to have. Now we'll switch to a bottom bowl gouge. I've got a 50 degree bevel on this, and this is more of a U-flute gouge. This is going to give us the clearance we need to make the curve without coming into contact with that rim because of that severe undercut we've got. So we'll pick up the cut. You can see there's a small indentation there. That's where we stopped with the scraper. We'll pick up the cut there and continue that curve to match inside to outside. All right, so we'll use the bottom bowl gouge here. And one thing you never want to do is when you get down to the center here, we never want to push the tool through it like that. I don't know if you saw it there. Let me do it one more time. This is what I see a lot of people do is they'll get to that center nub and then they snap it off. You don't want to force the tool through the wood because it splits that out. And once we get down to that 1/4 inch wall thickness, you're going to have a bunch of tear out that you're not going to have material to cut through it and have a clean surface. So as we're getting down to that center nub, the center is turning at a lot slower RPM than the outside of the rim here. So as we get to center, we slow down our feed rate, and then we just let that nub come off. That's going to give us a better surface down in the center of our bowl, and it's not going to tear out those fibers. And you can see that the outside of this piece is moving a lot more now that we're getting rid of all of its supporting material. Slow it down. Let's check our depth real quick before we get too far. We probably have a 1/2 inch or so left to go, I would guess. Maybe about 1/4 to 3/8. We'll check that with the calipers in a second. So let's pick up here where we left with the scraper and then continue that curve down to the center now that all that material is out of our way. So I'm going to pick up on the heel of the gouge, find out where the tool is, and then we'll just adjust our handle angle to engage the cut. We want a nice flowing curve, continuous curve. We don't want to fill any starts or stops or any flat areas on the inside. Let's just check our wall thickness for that lower third. So we're just a little bit heavier than we are at the beaded section towards the rim. And we're about a 1/2 inch, and we're about 1 inch in the bottom there. So we got plenty of material to remove. Again, pick up the cut on the bevel first. Nice and easy, we're about at our overall depth. Got about a 1/2 inch in the bottom. I don't want to go too much deeper than that. I'll probably take off about 1/8 of an inch. That way if I need to change the curve on the outside slightly, I've got the room to do it. So I'll probably just clean that up in the very bottom, but I need to blend from the rim to the bottom there. I'm just a tad heavy. So I'm getting a fair amount of flex out of this piece. So let's go back to the scraper. We'll support it with some shavings. Use your thumb on top of that scraper for a little extra help. I think we're ready for a quick sharpening. There we go. And be very, very mindful of the rim with your tools. It's really easy to be in there with your gouges and you don't realize the shank of the gouge is pushing into the rim until that rim explodes because it doesn't like that pressure, especially when you're getting really thin like this. So I'm happy with that. Let's grab our sandpaper and we'll just hit that with some sandpaper real quick. That surface is pretty clean. It's not as clean as the exterior. That negative rake scraper just tore this out ever so slightly on the growth rings there. I'm going to smooth out the center nub. It's just a little bit high right there as well. Go to a fresh section of the cutting edge. There we go. We'll drop our speed down for the sanding. And I'm just going to soften this rim ever so slightly. If you want a power sand, go ahead. Just some sheet paper is going to be good enough for what I'm looking for out of this piece. As far as the finish goes, you can just throw some oil straight on it. You can throw some scratch free on it. That's what I'm going to do. It's going to be an oil wax, a little bit of a polishing grit in there. Going to refine that surface. But I would say wait till it dries completely if you're going to be doing any solvent-based finishes. Just let it fully dry and then wipe those on once it's done moving. But we'll finish the top half. I'm going to grab some of these bigger shavings and then just burnish the inside. And because we're going to be turning the bottom of this, I'm not going to go scratch free all the way down. I'm just going to leave it on the top third. Once we rechuck it and sand that bottom foot area, then we'll throw the scratch free on. But you can see this piece has moved a lot since we put this in the chuck initially. Getting rid of all the supporting fibers in the center of the bowl there relieves a lot of tension throughout the fibers so they move. Plus it's wet and it's drying as we're turning it, so it's moving even more. So this is kind of one of those projects where you pretty much, once you start it, you kind of just have to finish it and do it and get it done all in one go. You don't want to leave this and come back a day later because this thing will not be running very true and it'll be way out of round. So, but you can see the color in there. That is just absolutely gorgeous material. This Gambel's oak, we hardly ever get in material big enough to turn bowls out of. So this is a real treat to turn a piece of wood like this. So I want to do it justice, make a nice little calabash out of this. But let's take this out of our chuck jaws now. Let's take our chuck off the lathe here. We'll throw our screw center chuck back on, and I've got another blank that's got a big crack in it that we'll use as our jamb chucking blank. Let's just snug that up. So this piece I'll be using for the jamb chuck. There are some pretty big cracks in here, so I will want to be mindful of my turning speed and making sure I'm keeping an eye on those as I turn. Once we rough this to round and get the wax off and remove some of this material, we'll see just how deep the cracks go. And once this is done as a jamb chuck, I might chop this down into smaller spindle blanks to get rid of these big cracks going through here. But I'll definitely be using my revolving center for extra support until we get this thing roughed to round. I don't have a lot of faith in this blank, but we'll see how it goes. Speed is 0. Make sure everything's nice and snug before we start cutting, especially the tool rest. It's one thing we see a lot in the classes is people don't tighten their tool rest, locking lever hard enough, and so they take a heavy cut and that tool rest drops down, and that creates a pretty unsafe scenario. So make sure your tool rest is nice and secure, and if you don't have the strength to really tighten that down, if you're doing heavy cuts, you know, at the far end of the rest and you're over the rest quite a ways, you know, you can always make a longer handle for some extra leverage. Not worried about the unsupported fibers on that end. That's going to be just fine. Just going to loosen that up and extend this. Get the clearance I need to get my tool rest on the face. And then we'll just square this up as well. And this peeling cut's going to be aggressive or not aggressive depending on how open or closed you leave the flute. If I close that over to 9 o'clock so I can't see the flute, it's not very aggressive, but if I start opening that flute, it takes a lot heavier cut and it's going to be a lot more aggressive. So I'm usually about halfway, you know, 9:30 or so. And then if I want to go heavier, I'll open that to about 10 o'clock. And you can take a lot of material out. So let's take a look at the cracks we had. So you can see these big cracks running through the side here, and then there was a huge one down here on this rim. So we still might be able to get a bowl out of this once we're done using it as a jamb chuck, but we'll see. But I definitely want to try and make a bowl out of it if I can. All right, so for the jamb chuck, the first thing we need to do is create a small taper. That way we can see where the bowl is actually going to seat on this piece. And hopefully this hasn't started to go ovally already. But let's cut a small taper down here on this corner. We'll bring this up to speed. Need to move that tool rest over. Tool does not have the support that it needs. Once we know where this bowl is roughly going to sit, then we can cut our tenon we need. Okay, so that's still quite a ways smaller. Let's add just a little bit more taper to it. We'll see where it's going to sit. Okay, that's going over. We can hold the bowl and just set that on there, and that should give us a nice little burnish mark. That's going to be right about there. Let's create a small little shoulder that bowl will seat up against too. And we want a nice tight fit. We want to be able to turn it without the tailstock engaged as we get down to the very bottom nub. So we need to have a nice snug fit, but not too tight to where we split our blank. Okay, we've got about a 1/16 of an inch to remove. And if you don't want to do a jam chuck method like this, you can always, there's 15 different ways of doing this. You can use a vacuum chuck, a jam chuck, Longworth chuck, adjust the jaws. There's a million different ways of doing this, but this is a nice way because it kind of preps your next bowl that you're going to be turning if you're turning multiples. All right, so that about wants to go on. You can see that big old crack right there is opened up now that we've got through that wax layer. I'm not sure how deep that goes. One thing I want to do when I am sizing this spigot here is the largest diameter of this is going to be down here in this corner. That way it doesn't decrease in diameter and it's tight and then it gets loose as you press it on all the way. Because this bowl has an undercut rim, the only surface that it's going to be engaging on is on this very top surface corner of the rim. That wants to go on, but I don't want to split it. Let's do one more cut, or maybe 10. Yeah, that'll split it. If you hear that snow crunching, popping noise, just take a little bit more off. We don't want too much popping, which leads to cracking, which leads to a bad day. If we need to, we can grab a spindle gouge too. Get a little bit cleaner of a cut here. I think this is it. This is it. This is the fit. Oh yeah. Beautiful. So you hear just a light, gentle, walking on snow, crunching, and then that final pop fit. And that's going to be a good enough fit to turn this without the center. Obviously you don't want to do crazy roughing cuts or anything because we would probably pull it off. But we have a good fit on our jam chuck, and it sets you up for doing your next bowl. So let's bring up our center, just as an added little precaution, safety measure. And I'm not going to push into that too hard. I don't want the divot from this cone center. Ideally, I'd have a cup center. I don't have one out here right now. But just nice light pressure, that's going to help keep that seated. And if you're worried about the fit and you don't have a really, really great fit, but still might work, you can always wrap this in tape or the shrink wrap, just to help give it a little extra bite, or you can use some paper towel as well. So I'm just a little bit heavy down here in the bottom, but that's going to be good as we get our final shape with this down to our center point. We're going to have to remove some of this to keep that curve looking nice and aesthetic. So let's go ahead and remove that tenon. And then we'll blend that into our surface we already had. Get that handle nice and low for the shear scrape. And right now I'm just eyeballing the horizon, looking to get a good flowing curve down to that base. I'm going to switch gouges here, something just a little bit smaller and more refined. And be mindful of your wall thickness. Hopefully, before you mounted this, you measured with your calipers to know exactly how much material you had down in the base. Otherwise, you'll be joining the funnel club, like most turners. This will be a really good calabash funnel. Make sure you check your measurements, know what your depth is. And you can hear the sound change as it gets thinner too. If you hear a really light, hollow, tinny sound, that means you're getting thinner. If you tap it, you can hear the difference between a heavy wall thickness and a thin wall thickness just with some experience. Turning a really thin wall thickness piece is a great skill builder because you learn what's too thin, what's too thick. You learn when you're going to go through a piece. There's a lot you can gain from it, even if you do turn through the piece. Just use a cheap piece to start out with so you're not turning a really nice piece and you have a hole in the bottom. Okay, that curve's looking really good. Let's get rid of the tailstock and cut that off. I'll switch to this smaller gouge with the 40/40 grind. Bring my tool rest over as well. Tool rest is a little low for the smaller diameter gouge, so bring that up just a touch. If you start getting chatter or vibration, that means the piece is trying to come off your jam chuck. All right, I'm going to take a step back, just look at the flowing curve that I've got from the top down to the bottom. I'm just going to refine it with the negative rake scraper just to smooth that out, get rid of any wavy or bumpy areas. And this should give us a good surface off the tool as well. Okay, let's grab our sandpaper and our scratch free. And then we'll just blend the areas between where we turned the top half and then this area that we just turned. We'll just try and feather those together so there's not a stark contrast between the two. I'm just going to hit this in reverse real quick. Make sure your chuck or your screw chuck is fully seated before you put your lathe in reverse, especially if it doesn't have a slow start and stop between forward and reverse. I've seen plenty of chucks come off the spindle when guys put their lathe in reverse and it doesn't have that slow down, speed up function. Just sanding with the grain. That looks nice. Now I'll just throw some scratch free on it, then we can get this piece off and we'll be done. And make sure you don't forget to put it back and forward. I've done that before. And then it throws your sandpaper out of your hand because you forgot. And this is going to be my final finish on the piece. As I use it, it'll get oil on there from salads and things, and then, you know, washing it, you can always reapply whatever food safe finish you put on. Okay, and now that we have that done, depending on the fit you have with your jam chuck, if it's a really, really tight fit, this is a good way of getting this off the piece without damaging your bowl. So we'll bump up our speed again, and I'm going to grab my narrow parting tool. This was a trick I learned from watching Stuart Batty's demos, is we're going to create a small little groove. So we've got about a 1/16 of an inch of material, and then we've cut that groove down to where it's on the inside of the bowl. It's not in contact with the rim, and then we can use our parting tool to pry the bowl off, and we're using that waste block, or our jam chuck material, as an interface between the bowl we're removing. Because you don't want to just grab a skew and try and jam it between your jam chuck and your finished bowl. It's definitely going to leave marks. So we're going to use that waste wood as a nice interface. And that's far enough off now. I can just pop that off. And then because we're going to be turning this as a bowl, all this will be coming off anyway, but that's a really good way of getting this off the Jamb chuck. So there's the finished bowl. I'm really happy with that. The grain structure in this is just unbelievably gorgeous. And it's really nice to be able to go from a wet piece of material to a finished piece all in one go. I don't have to let this sit and dry and cure for a few months. But I'm going to leave this overnight. We'll let this sit here on the lathe, see how much it moves, and then tomorrow when we come back in, we'll see what it looks like. So let's leave this here. We'll get it cleaned up and we'll see you in the morning. All right, so we've come back a day later and the bowl has tightened up about 1/4 inch on the width. It's about 7 inches long this way and then 6 3/4 on the width. And it's moved a fair amount, but it'll continue to dry over the next few days. But it's just a really fun bowl. I really like turning this. This is a gorgeous piece of material. And if you want some extra credit, while you're waiting for your bowl to dry and move, you can always carve some wooden spoons out of a matching material, and that makes a nice little set. So hopefully you've watched the video all the way through. You've learned some tips and tricks that we covered while we turned this Calabash bowl. It was a lot of fun turning this project, but if you have any questions or comments, or you've turned a Calabash yourself, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.